Okay, guys, got a fairly quick little online lesson for this week. Picked these two some time back because even though you might say, well, what do they have in common? In fact, when you think about it, they have quite a bit in common. They're both dealing with authors who are exploring changes between generations and the cultural changes that take place. We'll start off here first with Yamamoto, 17 syllables. Just going to add some commentary here. Not going to give a formal lecture on it. I'm going to actually ask you guys in the discussion to continue your analysis of the piece, if you would, and then also kind of walk through Gwendolyn Brooks' very famous poet, We Real Cool. It's a short poem. Both of these deal with short poetry, right? One deals with haiku, one is an actual short poem. Diving into 17 syllables, now naturally you have the story of Rosie and her parents. Rosie is a different generation. She's a second generation Japanese American. Her parents both first generation. And she's sort of dealing with the changes or she's dealing with the fact that her generation is different from her parents' generation. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about living in the United States is that very frequently, because we have so many immigrants to our country, a lot of the children of immigrants will have interesting lives and stories, and sometimes those aren't the most positive in some ways. We like to think of the American dream and onward and upward and everybody's a success and everything, but there's an awful lot of pressure on immigrant kids. Some of you guys might be second generation immigrant families, and if so, you probably know what I mean, is that your parents will tell you, or your grandparents will tell you, we sacrificed everything to come here. We gave up everything we had, and they expect you to be, they expect you to win the Nobel Prize. They expect you to be a great achiever, and they want you to be perfect, and they've invested a lot in you emotionally. And, that can sometimes be a recipe for disaster for a family, right? And so I think Yamamoto, although she's not kind of looking at it in exactly that way, she is kind of exploring this question of how these two generations with very different experiences are able to communicate and not able to communicate at the same time. What are those limitations? And of course, haiku becomes this central thing in the story that a metaphor, if you will, for, if you know anything about haiku, it's a 17 syllable poetry, right? A syllable poem, and it's very sparse. It's very minimalistic. You're supposed to sort of get a lot out of very little, right? So it's supposed to, the constraint of the poem is its appeal, right? It's like doing something that's really hard. And you admire the ingenuity of the person of pulling it off. If it didn't have constraints, if you could just write a poem that just went on and on and on, it wouldn't be that hard, right? So the art of it is in part, it's often been compared, for example, to these kinds of the shrubs and things, the gardening that's done, where you have to make sure that you've got like little miniature figurines and shaping the plants into different constricted forms and things like this. That there's an art and an artistry in being able to pull it off in such a compact manner, and then you spend time kind of teasing out the meaning of it. Well, of course, Rosie and her parents, there's some language barrier there, right? To some extent. Rosie is growing up with American English. Her mother is still very, very Japanese, and her father's English apparently is better. But there's, they communicate, but they don't communicate that well. She goes to Japanese school, which is kind of like it's school for Japanese students, but it's designed to teach them Japanese as well as English and everything else. They used to have that a lot. Probably the better analogy would be Hebrew school, right? Jewish kids go to Hebrew school, so they don't just learn, the Torah and all of that, and math and English and all these kinds of stuff. They learn Hebrew, right? So it's designed to have them connect and stay connected with their culture, their language, their religion, all of that kind of thing. So she's going to Japanese school, but she's not learning Japanese very well. She doesn't learn it very well. She doesn't have that great enthusiasm for it, etc. Interestingly enough, I've spoken to many students who are sort of third generation or second generation sometimes, where the family will come to the United States and they will say, we want you to learn English, and we're going to just try to speak English around the house, and we're not going to have you learn, we're not going to have you teach, we're not going to have you speak Spanish or German or Italian or whatever. And the kid grows up going, okay, I'm learning English. I'm doing my best to learn English because English is the key to success in schools in America. But what happens is later in their lives, that second generation, and sometimes especially the third generation, wishes the family had held on to that language because now they don't know anything about. I spoke to a young woman whose family is Greek, and she says, I never learned any Greek growing up in my household because my parents wanted me to learn English so badly that we just didn't speak Greek. We always practiced our English. And she said, now as an adult, I wish I had learned Greek because I don't know much about where I come from. So there's these, you see that there's the question of achievement and sacrifice and the difference between the generations there. There's a language and culture generation difference. Some of you guys may be, like I said, part of families that are recent immigrant families, and you know what I'm talking about, and the pressure on you, and then the feeling of, well, my grandparents came from Greece, but because I don't speak Greek, I don't feel like I'm authentically Greek. I don't feel like I'm culturally authentic, and so that makes you feel kind of inferior to, your grandparents in some way. It's like, well, they know how to make this stuff. They know how to cook this stuff. They know what the words are for this stuff. And I mean, I know I'm descended from them, but I don't really feel Greek or Nigerian or Mexican or Peruvian or whatever you are. So it's kind of a funny thing. So both these guys are kind of exploring that question, but with Yamamoto, it's about an immigrant experience here. And so Rosie and her mother have this gap between them, and it's a communication gap and it's also a generational gap. And introduced into the midst of this is, of course, a very sweet story. She and Jesus, the young kid who works for a family that picks tomatoes and whatnot, they harvest tomatoes and things. They're good friends. They yuck it up. They have a lot of fun. They kind of go to school a little bit together, or they hang out together, I should say. And eventually you see where this is going. And it's very sweet. I'm sorry, I think it's really cute. That she doesn't realize that he's got the sweets for her, and eventually they meet up, and there's nothing like awful about it. He holds her hand, and then he decides to kiss her. And the funny thing is, and I think this is really an interesting passage because it seems so genuinely teenagerish. Now, I'm not going to ask you to share in the discussion the first time someone kissed you, okay? Because that's too personal. However, if you recall the first time you were kissed by somebody, or somebody tried to, maybe, I don't know, because they had a real crush on you, or you had a crush on them, or whatever, it's the first time is like, I don't know how I feel about this. On the one hand, it was thrilling, but on the other hand, it's kind of gross and yucky. So that's such a totally natural, normal, genuine response. When he took hold of her empty hand, she could feel no words to protest. Her vocabulary had become distressingly constricted, and she thought desperately that all that remained intact now was yes and no and oh. Now, again, it's a story about the limitation of language to convey things. Sometimes that limitation is intentional, as in haiku. Sometimes it's unintentional because there's no way to express what you're feeling or what you think, or the words aren't able to adequately encapsulate what you're trying to convey. So this is central to the story. It's really interesting. And it happens here with her kiss. Thus, kissed by Jesus. Did you notice this? It just kind of skims straight to, oh, she was kissed, right? As though it just kind of rushed over. Thus, kissed by Jesus, Rosie fell for the first time entirely victim to a helplessness delectable beyond speech. So look at the choice of the words. Helplessness is not something that's positive, right? Helplessness, oh gosh. But it's a delectable helplessness. Isn't that great? The little kind of oxymoronic there. It's like, I feel helpless, but it was great, right? It was wonderful being kissed. But the terrible, beautiful sensation, again, with the oxymoronic. You see what she's doing? Because haiku does a lot of that, right? Oxymorons, or they put words next to each other, juxtapose words that are strange and make you stop and think. The terrible, beautiful sensation lasted no more than a second, and the reality of Jesus's lips and tongue and teeth and hands made her pull away with such strength that she nearly tumbled, right? All of a sudden, afterwards, she just kind of pulls away, almost instinctively, like, whoa, what was that? It's not that she didn't like it. It was just kind of like, whoa, never done that before. And maybe a little bit of surprise, but also it's clear that there was a pleasant surprise because she's kind of looking for ways to kind of meet up with him later on. Because she's kind of got a thing for him. But the fact that it's not just like something out of a movie where she's kissed and suddenly it's passion, right? It's the fact that she's kissed and she's like, oh, okay. That was kind of nice, but weird, right? So that's so incredibly authentic when she does that. And so at first you realize, you ask yourself, what is that episode, that interlude doing here in a story that evidently is about a mom who loves to write haiku, who's actually very good at it. She wins this first prize competition. She gets a prize for it. And the dad is so weird about this. What is going on with the dad? Why isn't he proud of his wife for being a great haiku writer? All of these kinds of things. Then we get a little bit of backstory towards the end. And although it doesn't necessarily excuse the father's behavior, we begin to understand that the marriage never was a very good marriage to begin with. And that's something that isn't resolved at the end of the story. It's sort of put at her feet, Rosie's feet, and she's got to decide what she's going to do with her life with respect to relationships and things like that. Because, the mother has people over, they talk about haiku, she goes over to other people's house, they talk about haiku, she's constantly writing haiku, she's really a great gifted poet, evidently. She's using the poetry as a vehicle of expression within a marriage that is repressive and stifling. It's her creative outlet. The husband begins to resent it more and more and more because why does he resent it? He resents it because he understands that the only way she's finding happiness is through her poetry, not through a relationship with him. He also has another reason to resent her because he apparently, as we find out at the end of the short story, was somewhat tricked into this marriage, or at least there was no full disclosure on the marriage. And he's angry about it and resentful. He's not a warm guy, but we were told that he was kindly when he was a young man. So something has deeply affected him in this marriage. She has found an outlet. She has found a source of happiness and satisfaction through her poetry. He hasn't found anything like that. And he resents the fact that she is turning to poetry to seek that happiness and not to a relationship with him, which is clearly just dead. It's a dead relationship. Back to Jesus, though, she really does like the boy. He's like 2 years older. Come on, girls like guys who are a little bit older, and he's a senior. And by the way, nothing is made of the fact that this is an interracial or interethnic relationship. That doesn't seem to be the barrier. She's not in the short story. We're not hearing Rosie say to herself, "Oh, what will my parents think that I have a crush on a Mexican American boy." It's really kind of not. She didn't raise that. So she wants to, and I think part of that is that Yamamoto wants to remove the question of race from it and focus on the people and the type of relationship. So she doesn't want that to be something that takes our attention away from the parent-child relationship, the husband-wife relationship, and the promise that the mother tries to extract from her daughter, which is an incredibly unfair promise. And she knows she's not going to make that promise happen. So she says she goes out to an outhouse, right? She goes to an outhouse to go to the bathroom, or she says she does. She says, in the privy, Rosie peered through a knothole toward the fields, watching as much as she could of Jesus. Happily, she thought she saw him look in the direction of the house from time to time before he finished unloading and went back toward the patch where his mother and father worked. So the first encounter where he kisses her is both surprising but pleasant. The second time, she's like trying to find a way to get a look at him from afar and hoping that he's looking over at her house and everything. So it's at just the very beginning phase of They've gone from friendship to actually liking each other in a romantic sense, and it's a sweet and endearing thing. And it's important that it happen that the mother's revelation to her happens at that moment. This is the first boy she's ever been interested in. She didn't initiate it, but she thinks it's kind of it's kind of thrilling to have a boy who's cute and nice to her, and he's a sweet guy. I mean, he's at first you think he's going to take her to the shed. What's he going to do? But he's really gentle and sweet and loving, and takes her by her hands, and then just plants one on her. But it's done in a very sweet and innocent way. So that's important. It's got to happen. What's about to happen with her mother has to happen at that point in her very first romantic relationship. The father destroys this painting, and it is a really angry, vindictive, cruel thing, right? A cruel thing to do. Why she doesn't leave her? Why she doesn't leave him? Why she doesn't protest? Not done in her culture. She can't. In that culture, at that time, with that woman and that man, she could not do it. In a sense, when we get the backstory, we realize she wouldn't do it even if she could, because much as she hates the relationship, she owes this guy, because this guy socially saved her from disgrace, basically. And that's the way she views it. No matter what he does, she can never be too angry about it, because she feels like, well, he married me, and I had to be married to get respectability, and he took me out of Japan and took care of me here, and if I were there back home, I would be disgraced. Because we find out that Rosie's mother, at the end of the story, she reveals to her and says, I'm going to tell you, like it or not, I'm going to tell you something that's going to really be upsetting to you. I'm going to tell you why I married your father. I was in love with somebody back in Japan. He was a rich guy. My family was poor. I got pregnant, and he could not marry me, and I had the child, and my family didn't kick me out, but she had the child. It was a miscarriage. It was stillborn. I'm sorry, stillborn. But everybody knew that she had gotten pregnant before marriage. That was a disgraceful thing at that time, and especially in that culture. The parents didn't kick her out, but she had that sense of shame and ignominy within that community. And so she writes to her sister and says, take me in. And the sister says, well, if I take you in, you can't just come to America. You really have to have a way to support yourself, and you don't even speak English. And so let me make this match for you with this guy. All fine and dandy. They may have actually been compatible, but he did not know about her past. And there's a sense of his feeling resentment about it. The young man, her father, was never told why his unseen betrothed was so eager to hasten the day of meeting. Right? Why is she so eager to meet me? Why are you so eager to hook me up with this girl? He finds out later, though, doesn't he? And he feels kind of betrayed. He feels resentment. You lied to me. Was I tricked into marrying somebody? Was I being used? Right? So it's sort of an irreparable thing. And so the mother, at the very end of the story, it's very important here. At the very end of the story, she says to her, Rosie, promise me you will never marry. Shocked more by the request than the revelation, Rosie stared at her mother's face. Jesus, she called silently, not certain whether she was invoking the help of the son of the Carrascos or of God. Coincidentally, or not, the boy's name is Jesus. Until there returned sweetly the memory of Jesus's hand, how it had touched her, and where. Yes, I promise, Rosie said. But for an instant she turned away. Right? So it's kind of like, yes, I promise. Right? It's rather disingenuous, you see. And her mother, hearing the familiar glib agreement, released her. Remember, she agrees with her a lot of times when she doesn't understand her. Right? Remember early in the story? She agrees with her when she doesn't. Yeah. Do you know what this line means? Yeah. Do you see this? Yeah. When she doesn't really, right? It's just kind of a way of kind of like, I don't know what do you want me to say? I don't know. I really don't understand, but I don't want to tell you I don't understand it. So when she says, tell me you'll never marry, she says yes. She doesn't really say it in a genuine way. She says it in the way that she always says the things that she says about her poetry, which is, yeah, I understand it, when she doesn't. And the response from the mother is very clear here. Oh, you, her eyes and twisted mouth said, you fool. Right? Think about this, that your mother makes you promise you'll never marry because of something awful that happened to her. But you see, as in old woman McGowan, right? Old lady McGowan, the fact that she's trying to protect her child, but what she's doing in trying to protect her is a kind of a selfish act. I need to protect you because of something awful that happened to me. And so I'm going to make you make this impossible, stupid promise that because marriage was hell for me, I'm going to ask you to promise you're never going to do it. Well, that seems rather unreasonable, to say the least. Rosie, covering her face, began to cry at last to cry, and the embrace and consoling hand came much later than she expected. That's a great line. So she begins to cry, and the mother eventually consoles her and hugs her, but not after. It came later than she would have thought. You ever cry and someone immediately says, oh, it's okay, and hugs you and pats you on the back? That's what you kind of expect. But if you start crying and then someone waits a while before doing it, what's that indicate to you? Kind of strange, isn't it? Again, distance between the mother and daughter, and it's cultural because it's generational, and it's linguistic because it's cultural and generational, right? So interesting stuff there. Let's take excuse me, while my voice holds up, take a quick look at Gwendolyn Brooks's poem. It's a very famous poem. It's a very short poem. Word has it that Brooks was led to write this poem because she was kind of walking by a pool hall. Of course, that's where it's set. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. 7 guys, 7 teenagers or young men, and it's presumed that they're young black men in an urban setting. And this was written. It says 1960. That's when the book was published, but it was written in 59 actually. But it doesn't really matter. And it begins like this: We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. Of course, everybody focuses in on the last line, right? And the first few lines are really interesting. We won't do a deep analysis of this. We'll let you do that if you want to. But it's a series of sentences that all begin with the same. We would in rhetoric you would call it anaphora, with the same word. Begins with the same word, we, okay? And so it begins with, we real cool, right? We're cool guys, right? People admire us, okay? Because we hang out at the pool hall, we know what's up, we're hip to what's going on. We left school, right? We're too cool for school, right? I don't do that school thing. We lurk late. Now, it's not we stay out late, we lurk. Right? What is lurking? How is lurking different? Okay, than just hanging out. To lurk means to hold back and look. Right? To kind of hide or hold back or almost stalking like. To lurk in the dark. We lurk late. We strike straight. Okay, we strike straight. Now it could mean we're straight shooters kind of thing, right? We don't pull any punches. You come up to us and you pick a fight. We go straight at you. It could be we strike straight as in straight away, quickly. Okay, we sing sin. We sing sin. Their singing, their songs are about transgression, about sin, right? And I don't think that she means singing just in the sense of like voice singing, right? What we do, right? What the art we create, if you want to call it art, is sinful art. Okay, our songs are about drinking and carousing and whatever else. We thin gin. That's a line that's always puzzled me a little bit. We thin gin. I think clearly it has to do with drinking, right? It has to do a lot with drinking. Do they mean thin gin as in we thin it, like we mix it? Okay, right? We mix gin. Or does it mean we thin that bottle down, right? We drink it down. But it's clearly about that. We jazz June is an interesting. See, notice how the sentences become murkier and murkier. What do they mean? What do they mean? Everybody knows what the first line means. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. Then it becomes more and more ambiguous as the poem progresses. What does that mean? What does it mean? We strike straight. What does that mean? We sing sin. Well, in what sense do they sing sin? Do they mean like literally singing, or what do they mean? What kind of sin? We thin gin. What does that mean? They're drinking it? How? We jazz June. Okay, interesting line. I don't know what that means. What do you think it means? We jazz June. Certainly June is a month out of the year. It's a warmer month. Jazz is a type of music. Does it mean that they play jazz, that they hang out in the summertime? June is when school is out. Of course, they dropped out of school. Then the last line, as the poem becomes increasingly a little bit ambiguous and a little bit fuzzier about what is meant by each of the statements, suddenly the poem brings you to a dead stop and gives you one last line that now reverses, and it's completely unambiguous. We die soon, right? Now, it's deceptively short and simple, as I say. Clearly the poem is about young African-American men, okay? This group, anyway, hanging out where they're hanging out together, and we know some characteristics about them, etc. But here's the interesting thing. What is the poet's attitude toward them? That's an interesting question. Some people read the poem and say, she's giving a moral warning to wayward youth. Maybe, I don't know, but it doesn't. It's given in their voice. It's not given in her voice. There's no commentary offered. Is she moralizing? Is it a sense that the poet is giving us of resignation, like, well, this is how guys are. Young men sometimes do stupid stuff, and they sometimes die soon because of it. They make bad choices. They drop out of school. They think they have a lot of confidence. There's nothing more, there's nothing more confident than, an 18-year-old guy who thinks he's going to live forever. And see, these guys do, but they don't have any clue as to how dangerous life is when you live it that way. So there's a sense of that's how life is for young men. They do stupid stuff and things happen, and it's unfortunate. Or is it about sadness? The we die soon. It's is she trying to express something here about how it's very unfortunate that these guys burn out, and why, right? So I think Brooks is probably seeing something within Black culture, a difference between her generation and this younger generation that she sees in the in the late 50s or whatever, between earlier generations of African Americans and this new urban group who seems more rebellious. How is it changing between those generations, and what caused that change? Clearly, when a lot of African American families moved from rural areas in the South because of World War I and World War II to more urban areas, industrialization, more jobs during the wars, to help with the war effort, they moved to places like Chicago and Detroit and Philadelphia and New York and places like that, Pittsburgh, and that followed those jobs. Their parents, who came there as a first-generation immigrant from rural to urban cities, urban areas, had a different set of values than the kids that grow up in those cities, in those challenging neighborhoods, right? So here, Gwendolyn Brooks doesn't give a commentary on it, but she certainly is presenting us with a generation that's different because of their circumstances, different with their attitudes, different with their behaviors from likely their parents' or grandparents' generation who grew up in, say, farming in rural areas. These are not kids that, for example, seem to be interested in church or anything like this, whereas their parents may have been. So there's a generational divide here that's kind of implicit in this poem. We're not given the causes, no explanations, no solutions. So we have to ask, what is the point of the poem? What is she driving at? Are we just to look at this and say, this is what happens? Stuff happens? Or are we to look at it and say, this is a big problem, and where does it come from, and what do we do about it? Because these young men are burning out their lives and wasting their lives in a way that their grandparents or great-grandparents, before they came to big cities, before they came to gang and crime and drug-infested cities, they never had to deal with that, right? So that difference between parent and grandparent and their experience and this new younger generation, I know it's 1960, but it was new then, and what they're experiencing, vastly different. Okay, so What we have here is our quiz. Question number 1, where does Rosie go to meet up with Jesus? Where does she go to meet up with him? And this is where he kisses her. Okay. Where are the young men located in Brooks's poem? That's a fairly easy one. They're talking about their lives. We hear their voices. Where are they at the time they're saying these things? It's going to be a short discussion. Everything's due Tuesday at midnight, and we'll see you in class on Thursday.